This is the review for Exam 2 of Art History Survey 2 at the University of Wyoming. One disclaimer before we begin. There are a few pieces in this review that you will not find on your slide list. For these pieces, you will not need to memorize the specifics for identification. However, there are general ideas or themes concerning the High Renaissance in these pieces that will be useful for preparing for your exam on Tuesday. I will pause briefly as each slide appears so that you can give yourself a practice exam if you need to. So, without further ado, let us begin. We begin with the Italian High Renaissance. This is the age of exploration. The world was getting bigger for Europeans. People were traveling much more and experiencing different cultures, and so on and so forth. Remember that artists were looking at the real world around them and making it better in their art. There are certain things that look awkward in the real world, so they tried to make it more beautiful and harmonious by altering it. One of the harmonious devices they employed was the pyramidal or triangular form, because it lends itself to stability. We also see the beginning of art history as we know it today. This is mostly due to the writings of artist, architect, poet, and writer Giorgio Vasari. Vasari was a contemporary of famous artists like Michelangelo. In his books, The Lives of the Artists, Vasari began writing down the history of art since the medieval times up until his time. Because of this and other factors, the social position of artists changed dramatically during this time period. Look at the date of this piece, 1495, just around 3 years after Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Again, this is the age of exploration. The High Renaissance was very much a part of this expanding world. What you see in this piece is not a true fresco. That is to say that it is not a wet fresco. Rather, this is a great example of fresco al secco, or dry fresco. Remember that with wet fresco, the paint becomes an actual part of the wall and is more or less permanent. This is not the case with dry fresco. The outcome of a dry fresco is not nearly as durable as its counterpart. However, Leonardo knew this, and because he had the mind of an inventor, he tweaked his paint recipe by adding oil to it. Unfortunately, it did not have the effect he had planned. Instead, it backfired, and within his own lifetime, touch-ups were required to keep the painting from chipping completely off the wall. Thus, what we now see is a heavily reconstructed piece. Some estimates say that nearly 90% of the original paint that Leonardo applied is gone. The Last Supper was commissioned by the Dominican convent Santa Maria del Grazi in Milan. It was to be placed in the dining hall of the convent, so that it could become a spiritual exercise for the monks. The orthogonals in the painting line up with the actual orthogonals in the room, so that the painting is an extension into reality. There is a paradox at work in which the viewer physically looks up at the painting from below, but looks down at the table at the same time. Prior to the High Renaissance, we may have seen actual halos surrounding Christ and the 12 disciples. But here we see that the light coming in from the window functions as the halo for Christ. The disciples are grouped in groups of 3. This intentional division creates an extra sense of energy. Along with this, Leonardo chose to paint the narrative moment where Christ reveals to his disciples that one of them would soon betray him. This piece also has its own unique history. If you have seen the recent film Monuments Men, then you already know some of this history. In the opening scene, we see that a certain building is being protected with sandbags and wood planks. They were actually protecting one wall in the dining hall of the Santa Maria del Grazi, the same wall that contained the Last Supper. They were protecting it from the bombs that were being dropped during World War II. And sure enough, the building was hit, destroying most of the structure except for the wall, which held this piece. This is a cartoon, or a preparatory drawing, for a painting that Leonardo intended to paint, but for one reason or another never did. We see the Virgin Mary and her child Jesus, and we are introduced to a new person, Saint Anne, who was Mary's mother. There is not much to be said here other than noticing the high Renaissance technique of the pyramidal form, which implies harmony and stability. Mona Lisa, the subject for this painting, was a Florentine woman. Leonardo worked on this painting for several years because he was using oil paint, which allows for an extended length of time to be devoted to the painting. But why is this painting so extraordinary? Why is it that when you see this painting in the Louvre, it is the most crowded room in the world? There is a deep connection that she makes with her viewers. She looks as if she really is full of life. We see this connection through her eyes. First, we notice that her eyes are on the same level as the horizon behind her. And second, her body makes slight turns towards the viewer, culminating with her eyes, which makes the final connection. The Mona Lisa also has its own unique history. Originally, the painting would have been wider and would have shown two columns flanking her. But over the years, she has been stolen multiple times, each time the thief cutting the very canvas out from the frame. Now she sits safely behind bulletproof glass. Vitruvius was an ancient Roman architect who had written treatises on how to make architecture that conformed to the ideal human body. Artists of the High Renaissance were absolutely obsessed with Vitruvius. According to Vitruvius, architecture was a structural metaphor for the human body. The proportions had to be perfect. For this drawing, Leonardo was thinking about this ideal human form and how it relates to architecture. The interaction of the circle and the square are in harmony with the human body. This is humanism, but it is also Neoplatonism, because Vitruvius was a pagan. Although this building dates much later, it has direct ties to Vitruvius. This structure represents the culmination of High Renaissance architecture. The design is based on the Roman temple. Each portico or porch is identical to the one porch found on a Roman temple. Palladio was reading both Alberti and Vitruvius. He was essentially trying to create Vitruvian architecture that mimicked the ideal proportions of the human body, much like Leonardo's drawing of the Vitruvian man. The circle and the square are the basic building blocks for harmony within architecture. Looking at this structure should remind you of an earlier Roman structure. We see the circle and the square were also crucial elements for the Pantheon in Rome. Raphael was a celebrity, much like Michelangelo and Leonardo, but he was much younger than these fellows. The Virgin and Child, or Madonna and Child, is a subject matter that Raphael excelled at. This is only one example of many that were completed in his lifetime. He did not use dramatic chiaroscuro. Instead, everything is evenly lit in a bright gold tone. This is also another use of the pyramidal form, which is also the same as the compositional triangle. We see a very wide base that narrows at the top of the Virgin's head. Because he was so famous, Pope Julius II commissioned a piece for Raphael to complete in the Vatican. When the Pope asked for something to be done, it was less of a request and more of an order. And so it was that Raphael began to paint the four walls of the Room of Signatures in the Vatican. Religion, poetry, philosophy, and law are the four themes that are represented on each of the four walls in the Room of Signatures. Here we will focus on philosophy, Greek philosophy to be exact. What we see here is a group of pagan philosophers, which is strange because this room is in the Vatican. However, we see again that the highest power in the land approves of this imagery because it is rationalized to show the power of God. The two most important figures are the two standing at the center. We have Plato on the left and Aristotle on the right. They both make iconic gestures with their hands. Plato points up towards the heavens, and Aristotle holds his hand open, palm down towards the earth. In Plato's gesture, we see that he is indicating to the unseen realm that exists all around us, which the Christians believed to be the divine realm of God. On the other hand, Aristotle's gesture indicates the empirical or physical realm. That which can only be seen is important, and nothing else. In addition to these two great philosophers, we also see Apollo, the god of arts, on the left, and Athena, the goddess of war, on the right. They both indicate the imperial program of the papacy's control on the Western world. This fellow here is supposed to be Michelangelo. Interestingly enough, while Raphael was busy painting the four walls in this room, Michelangelo was working on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel just down the hall. Raphael himself can also be found here in the corner. And, for any Guns N' Roses fans, you may appreciate this. Recognize these two guys? It just goes to show that the art of the past truly does inform the art of today. Moving right along. An important thing to know about Michelangelo is that he was primarily a sculptor. He knew how to paint, he just didn't like doing it. We see the Virgin and Child, but Jesus is no longer a child here. His mother Mary is cradling the deceased Christ. This was meant to be a powerful reminder of the nativity of Christ. Originally, this sculpture was meant to be seen at eye level, so that pilgrims and spectators alike could gaze down into the face of Christ for reflection. Unfortunately, it was badly damaged by someone in modern times. After it was repaired, it was then placed up high and behind bulletproof glass in St. Peter's Basilica. If I would be allowed to voice my own thoughts, though, I would say that not much is lost in the viewing because we can still gaze into the sorrowful eyes of Mary. Anyways, When we do look at Mary, we see a rather young woman, much too young to have a son who died in his mid-30s. Instead, Michelangelo has chosen to depict her in her ideal beauty. Being a high Renaissance artist, his sculptures did not merely mimic real life, but rather improved reality to make it better looking. We see this improvement in the way that Mary seems to be effortlessly holding the bulk of her son's weight. He altered her proportions so that her hips are gigantic and function as a platform to cradle Christ. This also serves as the base for the pyramidal form, bringing harmony to the piece. Now let's look at a piece that you are all very familiar with already. Like Leonardo, Michelangelo dissected human cadavers as research for his drawings of human anatomy. Although this was a great way to study human form, it was not accepted as appropriate conduct during his time. This piece was commissioned by the city of Florence to be placed way up high in one of the niches of the Florence Cathedral. This is an important piece of contextual information because originally this David would have been seen standing up high in a niche, with the viewers arching their necks back to get a good look at him. Michelangelo ingeniously adjusted the physical elements of David so that certain features could be clearly seen from the vantage point of way below. We see that he has very broad shoulders and overemphasized hands. The detail is astonishing. We can even see his veins emphasized as adrenaline rushes through his body. This adrenaline and tenseness, which is also seen in David's face, is due to the narrative moment that Michelangelo chose to depict. When compared to Donatello's David, we can see some key differences. Michelangelo's David is older than Donatello's. We also see that two very different moments in this narrative are being depicted. Donatello's version has David standing triumphant with one foot on Goliath's decapitated head, and with the giant's sword in his hand. Michelangelo's version is just before this, at the pregnant moment in the narrative. David is tense and ready for battle. He has chosen his weapon, and his eyes stare at Goliath in the distance. The stage is set and the battle is about to begin. It is the most intense moment of the story. Despite the artist's genius effort to alter the body, the officials of the city of Florence saw how amazing this sculpture was and decided that they could never betray its beauty by placing it way up high on the cathedral. So they had it placed on the ground instead. All is not lost though. The statue still stands at about 17 feet tall, so we still have to look up into David's eyes to catch the intense gaze of a warrior about to do battle. Pope Julius II, who was all about connecting the power of the papacy with the High Renaissance, commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo refused at first, but the Pope made him do it in the end. So, against his will, Michelangelo began work on this large and complicated surface with the help of a number of assistants. Because he was such a difficult man to work with, eventually he dismissed all of his assistants, so that he alone was painting this ceiling. He spent hours upon hours doing this back-breaking, exhausting work. The finished piece that we see features the narrative found in Genesis, from the first book of the Bible. Right now, if you were to walk into this tourist attraction, you would see that the ceiling is illuminated by floodlights from below. But in those days, the chapel was lit by candles. Candles, as we know, create ash. Over hundreds of years, the ash built up and caked the ceiling with a filthy coat of soot and dirt. So, up until the 1980s, the original coloring was tainted by this thick layer of soot. Because of this previously unknown fact, art historians had always pondered how the brief style in art known as Mannerism came to being. The Mannerists used bright, flamboyant colors that were unusual for their time, and scholars could never understand why. But in the 1980s, they finally received their answer. It was in the 80s that a massive restoration of the Sistine Chapel ceiling began. With just a sponge and water, a small section was wiped clean. What came off of the ceiling was tested for any pigments. The results showed that there was only ash and no pigment at all. So the cleaning continued while cameras were rolling to document the process, and the results were astonishing. The ceiling revealed that Michelangelo was not using chiaroscuro, but rather he was using these really odd colors, which now gave reason for the beginnings of Mannerism. This was the missing link. Looking back at the creation of Adam, we see that the colors of God's beard and tunic are very bright colors. We can also clearly see the giornata in the outline around Adam. Remember that giornata was the amount of work that an artist could do in one day with wet fresco. What you see here is the last scene of the Apocalypse from the book of Revelation in the Bible. This piece really shows the beginnings of Mannerism. The colors, again, are very unusual for this time. All of the figures to our left of Christ are ascending into heaven, but all of the figures on the right are being dragged into hell. Saint Bartholomew is seen just to the bottom right of Christ with his own flayed skin in hand. You may ask why a saint is depicted on the side of the damned. This is because this is actually a self-portrait of Michelangelo. In doing this, he is revealing his humbleness as an artist. This was Michelangelo's original plan for the tomb of Julius II, who was the Pope. Moses originally would have been seated on the top of this structure, and therefore seen from below, much like how David was originally supposed to be on the top of the Florence Cathedral. Michelangelo never achieved his original purpose, and ended up with this as the finished tomb. Now Moses sits on the ground at eye level with the viewer. Always looking to improve physical reality, Michelangelo altered the proportions. Moses' calves appear to be larger than they should be, but they're not. Because of the original vantage point, he basically cut Moses' knees in half, so that the viewer would be able to see Moses' face without his knees obscuring it. Tempietto is the Italian term for little temple. We can clearly see the Roman influences of this temple, but also that it is not an exact copy. Where this temple is built is believed to be the exact location that St. Peter was martyred. So this temple also serves as a reliquary to St. Peter. It was commissioned by Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who also funded Columbus's expedition to India. This is Correggio's Assumption of the Virgin, from the dome of the Parma Cathedral in Italy. The interior of this dome reveals the full realization of the ideals and techniques of the High Renaissance. We now move to the Venetian High Renaissance. Recalling the Bellini lineage from father to son that we saw earlier from the Venetian Renaissance, we see a similar artistic lineage from master to apprentice, or teacher to student. It begins with Giorgione and his student Titian. Once Titian becomes established as an artist, he in turn teaches Tintoretto. Let's begin with Giorgione. We see two adults and an infant in the foreground, but in the background a storm is brewing. This storm is where the title comes from. The storm is the tempest. The narrative of this particular scene is somewhat vague. It is a given that there is an overall Christian theme, but the details are not known. The most probable theory is that this is a manifestation of the Roman poetry in visual form. Basically, poetry told through the lens of art. Masters commonly had apprentices working for them in their workshops during the Renaissance, just as we saw with Michelangelo and his assistants in the Sistine Chapel. Giorgione completed the difficult parts of this piece, and Titian filled in the less complicated parts. We see two men playing instruments on a lawn with two nude women. Was this common practice for men to lounge in public with naked women? No, these women are here as a connection to the ancient world. Somehow, they are related to poetry. The painting itself is a visual poem, with the nudes taking the place of the muses. This is a personification of creativity itself. It was common during this time for the wealthiest men to have mistresses. It was also common practice for these men to have the mistresses painted so that they could show them off to their friends. The woman seen here is the mistress of the Duke of Urbino. This is not his wife. When you first look at this painting, you should immediately see a clear focal point. Her left hand, along with the implied line created by the edge of the dark curtain behind her, act to guide our eyes to her private area. This painting is basically about sex. To top it off, we see a dog at the foot of the bed. We know that certain dogs represent fidelity, but this dog happens to be sleeping, suggesting that fidelity itself is sleeping. This painting serves as our transition from the High Renaissance to the Baroque era. When compared to Leonardo's Last Supper, we can see a significant difference from the start. Here we see a total lack of clarity and harmony, which goes against the ideals of the High Renaissance. There is dramatic lighting, dramatic diagonals, and an overall sense of chaos. Tintoretto was intentionally counteracting the High Renaissance because of an anti-Reformation program. Because of the start of the Reformation in the 1560s, there was a huge push in Italy to counter it and to make Catholicism much more powerful and dynamic. Now we'll go back and look at Mannerism. We've seen an entombment scene before, depicted in art, but this style has never been seen. There was a group of young artists who idealized Michelangelo and his use of vibrant colors. These artists became known as the Mannerists. The term Mannerism comes from Manneria, which is the Italian word for hand. It basically translates into a conscious style of self-expression by their own hands, an overly stylish way of making art. You may notice in this piece that the proportions are off. The figures in the background are either floating in air or standing on risers. We also see a few of the figures wearing odd skin-tight bodysuits. Then we see the man at the bottom who holds the bulk of the weight of Christ on his shoulders. But he is crouching with his feet on his tiptoes as if to defy gravity. All of these choices were intentional for Pontormo. Proportion and scale are neither accurate nor important for this artist. Certain elements are elongated, especially this leg on the left. The man on the bottom right disrupts the effortless portrayal of dimension that high Renaissance artists employed so easily. Looking at the bottom of this column, we also see that there is a whole row of them behind it. Yet when we look up at the top of the column, we see just one standing alone. This doesn't make any sense, and it's not supposed to. These were the ideals of the Mannerists. There is not much to say here other than the awkward placements of his hands and fingers. Also, his left shoulder is hidden behind his back, revealing a lack of clarity to the viewer. As well as inspiring the painters of Mannerism, Michelangelo also inspired the sculptors of Mannerism. This is the Medici Chapel in San Lorenzo. On the right, we see the tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici and the representations of dusk and dawn. The two reclining figures are personifications of dusk and dawn. On the left, we see the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici and the personifications of night and day. These figures are not really relaxed. They are twisted and contorted. The figures are not very high Renaissance, are they? Because of this, we are put psychologically on edge. It is not harmonious. In 1527, due to the rising power of the imperial papacy, Rome was sacked by Charles V. Afterwards, secular power began to rise. Cellini was widely known as a Mannerist sculptor. He did this kind of metalwork often. We see Gaia, who represents earth as well as pepper, on the left, and Poseidon, who represents the sea and salt, on the right. These two figures are very beautiful and classical looking, but they are sitting in awkward and uncomfortable positions, frozen in time. It is this awkward and tense pose that becomes the beauty of this piece. This is a bronze statuette, perhaps a maquette for a larger piece that was never completed. Like many other pieces, the title for this piece had nothing to do with the artist. It is purely a way for art historians to identify the piece. Gian Bologna was trying to achieve this extreme, long, and beautiful contour line of her body. But at the same time, she is leaning on a very unstable support. Her pose is physically impossible, and thus it is artificial, but she looks fantastic nonetheless. And finally, we move to the Northern High Renaissance. We can no longer look at Flanders as we knew it, because geographic shifts have altered boundaries into a whole new Northern Europe. Nevertheless, we'll jump right to it. Again, look at the date of this piece. This altarpiece is more or less contemporary with Leonardo's Last Supper in Milan. This altarpiece is a reliquary for some of the blood of Christ. But it is in the next piece that we will dive back into the idiosyncratic iconography of the North. This is what the Eisenheim altarpiece looks like when it is closed. At first glance, it almost appears as if it is already open. But if you look closely, you will notice a line running down the middle of the piece, just to the left of Christ. This opens up to reveal the inside. But this altarpiece is unique because it opens up a second time to reveal this. We could spend hours talking about all of the iconography for both of the inside views, so we will focus instead on the outside. For this piece, we will focus on three things: iconography, style, and cultural context. We see the crucifixion scene in the middle, with the usual figures present. The Apostle John comforts the weeping mother of Jesus. Mary Magdalene is also seen at the foot of the cross. To the right, we see John the Baptist with one hand holding the Bible and the other pointing to Christ, as if to say that he was the prophet to announce the coming of the Messiah. Near the feet of John the Baptist is a lamb with a wound in its chest, pouring out blood into a chalice. This represents the Eucharist, which also represents Jesus as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. You may recall that you've seen this before in the Ghent altarpiece. The left panel shows Saint Sebastian and the right panel shows Saint Anthony. Looking at the style, we see that scale and proportion are a little off. This is because Vitruvian ideals were not important in the North. We also notice when taking a closer look that this is an intensely gruesome depiction of the death of Christ. The details are so intense that we can really feel the amount of suffering that Christ endured on the cross. This is because of the original setting of this altarpiece. This piece was created for the chapel of a monastic hospital that helped people with terrible skin diseases. Pilgrims and patients from this hospital contemplated the sufferings of Christ, as well as Saint Anthony, and were then given comfort and solace. Albrecht Dürer was the biggest celebrity of the Northern Renaissance. Remember that Italy had the Medici family and the Vatican to hasten and promote the status of the Renaissance, but the North struggled to gain status. As a young man, Dürer traveled to Italy to learn from the Italian artists and to improve his own craft. He noticed immediately that the Italian artists were treated much better than he ever was in the North. He also noticed that he was just as good, if not better, than these artists in the South. This self-portrait depicts his idea that he was just as good as the Italians and deserved far more credit than he had been given up to that time. He was trying to get more recognition by showing off his amazing skills, much like Jan van Eyck did with his self-portrait. He was also trying to present himself in a greater light by depicting himself to look like Jesus. Although Dürer was a phenomenal painter, he was also very skilled in printmaking. This woodcut was made for his short book titled The Apocalypse. This book contained 14 full-page illustrations, as well as text on the back of each page. This is perhaps the most famous of those illustrations. The four horsemen represent conquest, war, plague and famine, and death. For this piece and for others, Dürer adapted Martin Schongauer's metal engraving technique to the woodcut medium. As early as 1494, Dürer began experimenting with engravings to the point that his work rivaled the great Schongauer's. He had an increasing interest in Italian art, which is seen in this piece. We see here that he is trying to achieve ideal human proportions based on Greco-Roman ideals. He also uses a combination of hatching, cross-hatching, and stippling to create the effect of chiaroscuro without actually using chiaroscuro. Within the landscape, we see symbols for the four humors, or four temperaments of the human body, which had to be kept in balance in order for the body to live. The four humors are symbolized by the elk, the cat, the ox, and the rabbit. The mouse at Adam's feet is a symbol for Satan. It is around this time, in 1517, that Martin Luther unknowingly started the Protestant Reformation. This launched most of Northern Europe into a period of iconoclasm in which all overtly religious art was banned, and a majority of the existing art was destroyed. Because of the Protestant Reformation, which began in 1517, Dürer aligned himself spiritually with Martin Luther, whom he admired very much. It is in this piece that we see Dürer openly profess that he was a Lutheran. We see St. Peter holding a key on the left, but he has lost his position of center stage. Now he is pushed into the background while the Apostle John shows him the Word of God, reinforcing the Protestant emphasis on sola scriptura, or Scripture alone. On the right panel we see the Gospel writer Mark standing behind the Apostle Paul. In painting these panels, Dürer was trying to alter his work to fit this new religion. Because of the strict iconoclasm brought about because of the Protestant Reformation, we see that artists have to think outside the box to paint other kinds of subject matter that had never been done before. Because landscape paintings contained no overt religious content, they became increasingly popular in the North during this time. The Danube landscape is one of the earliest examples of pure landscape painting without a narrative subject or human figures. Gosser was an artist who painted in the Romanizing style, which was directly inspired by the Mannerist painters. In painting this, Gosser was basically trying to communicate that religious imagery is divinely inspired and therefore okay to use as subject matter in art. This divine inspiration can be seen in the way the angel guides Luke's hand as he draws the Virgin and Child. We also see Moses in the background with the Ten Commandments in his hands, as if to reinforce this subject matter. This was a very nice attempt by Gosser, however it did not succeed, and Europe continued to be divided on this issue of portraying overt religious content in art. We see in this painting that Bruegel was struggling to paint without using religious imagery. What we have is a depiction of everyday life in the Netherlands. This is one painting in a series of 6 done that featured the months of the year. The return of the hunters shows the months December and January. A row of trees, beginning with the hunters in the foreground, recede into the middle of the painting to draw our eyes to the vast landscape. This concludes the review for Exam 2. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask by email, or you can talk to me before or after class. Good luck studying, and may the force be with you.